Greetings, students. So today we're going to do a little screencast looking at the history of evolutionary thought and natural selection. The objectives are highlighted here. Basically, we're going to be focusing on the theory of evolution by natural selection, and then near the end, we're going to talk about some examples of evolution as well. So let's begin with a little history. So the idea of evolution, the idea that species change over time, is actually a fairly old one. One of the more famous examples of sort of a scientific explanation for how evolution might have occurred was laid out by someone named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Uh, and you can see he lived from 1744 to 1829. This is a long time ago. And Lamarck believed that traits improve by using them more, and that traits fade away if they're not used. So basically, the idea would be that you have this giraffe and he's thinking, man, I'd really like to eat those leaves. And so he's like, let me just stretch my neck out here and try and get it. I can do this. I know I can. And then his neck just kind of gets a little bit longer. And then he has a kid, and the kid's like, yeah, it's a good idea. I'm going to do that too. Stretch, stretch, stretch. And the neck gets a little bit longer in the next generation. And then the next generation, it gets a little bit longer. And so the idea is that by stretching your neck, you get a longer neck. And at this point, you may be thinking, what? That does not make much sense. What are we talking about here? And you're right, it doesn't make much sense. Turns out it's dead wrong. Sorry, Lamarck, you're wrong. You blew it. You missed it. And he can be forgiven because you know a lot that he did not know. He did not know about DNA. He did not know about heredity. He didn't understand how traits were passed on. And he was just trying to come up with an explanation for how species change over time. And he kind of based that on behavior. But of course, in science, you can't just say you're wrong. You have to support that with evidence. And so an experiment was done by a person named August Weismann. And basically, he disproved this idea. And what he did, it's kind of sad, he chopped off the tails of mice. And then he bred them. And Lamarck would predict that the offspring would have shorter tails, but they didn't. So Weismann took the offspring, chopped their tails off, and mated them. And guess what? Tails were the same length as before, no change. So he chopped their tails off, and he kept going. And I feel like he did like a lot of generations of chopping poor mice's tails off, and there was never any notable change in that. And so this idea of acquired characteristics just doesn't quite pan out, and that should make sense, right? So I don't know, if you've seen me in person, you'll see I'm kind of a scrawny guy, but if I like lifted weights and buffed up and became huge, that doesn't mean that if I have a child, the child will be totally ripped and huge, right? That's not how genetics works. So so the idea of evolution was kind of still on the fringe for a long time until the mid 1800s when Charles Darwin came on the scene. Charles Darwin, at the age of 22, that's not that old, he began a voyage as the naturalist on a ship called the Beagle. And the naturalist's job was, this is kind of at the time when scientists in Europe, or actually people in Europe, were sort of spreading out to other continents and discovering new lands. And they would always have a naturalist on board who would study the plants and animals and geology and things like that, rocks, to try and see what we could learn from these new areas. And so Charles Darwin was that person. He was the naturalist. His job was to look at plants and animals as this ship sailed from Europe to South America. They stopped in the Galapagos Islands, which is a very influential place for Charles Darwin's ideas, and then they looped around the world past Australia, Africa, and then whoop, back home. So, so Darwin was on this ship, and along this trip, during this journey, he had a lot of observations and influences that helped shape his ideas of evolution. One, he read a book. You're sitting in the ocean for weeks on end, might as well do some reading, right? So he read Charles Lyell's book called Principles of Geology. And this book was all about this relatively new idea at the time that the Earth changes very slowly over many years. So among many examples, Lyell talked about the Grand Canyon and how these rock layers on one side of the canyon match the rock layers on the other. And so Lyell proposed that the canyon was actually carved out by erosion from this river. And so slowly, gradually, over thousands of years, this river carved out that canyon. Slow, gradual change leading to significant outcomes. And that, could be applied to biology, where slow, gradual change can lead to radically different species over time. Um, on those Galapagos Islands I mentioned before, Darwin made a number of observations that helped shape him. One, he noticed that on the mainland of South America there was this finch species, but then on the islands there were different finch species, and those different ones, they kind of were similar to each other, and they definitely were similar to the mainland, but they were different too. And he thought, is it possible that there was one original finch species that sort of migrated to these islands and then adapted and changed in response to the environment on each of those islands? Maybe. He also noticed that in South America, he found some fossils where extinct animals resembled animals living in the area. And he wondered, were they related? So he found this giant glyptodont. This is about as tall as a person. Huge armored creature, very similar to the armadillo. And so why would we find this fossil in the same area that this modern armadillo is? Coincidence, or were they related? This guy, coolest fossil on Earth, Megatherium, this giant ground sloth. Look how tall that thing was. Again, a sloth found in South America where sloths are found today. The ones found today are much smaller, look totally different than this. But again, is it possible that they were related to each other in some way? Darwin wondered. So Darwin basically went on this trip. He returned home. He studied. He wrote. He made observations about his ideas. And then in 1858, he got home in 1836. So it's almost like 20 years later, over 20 years later. He was contacted by someone named Alfred Wallace. And Darwin had been formulating these ideas that we now know as natural selection for 20 years. And basically in 1858, he gets a letter from Alfred Wallace that says, "Hey, Charles Darwin, I got this idea. Take a look. What do you think?" And Darwin read this and thought, holy smokes, Wallace just came up with the exact same idea that I've been formulating for the last 20 years. And so they handled it very well. They agreed that they would publish at the exact same time on the exact same day. And while Wallace was like this little, like, basically post-it note worth of information about this idea, because he just had thought of it, Darwin had 20 years worth of research and study and observation to build it up. And so Darwin published this book on the origin of species in 1859 that laid it all out. And that's why Darwin kind of gets the credit for this today. So Darwin in this book had two conclusions. One, the simple idea, which he called descent with modification. That's a fancy way of saying that species change over time. That was not a new idea. Lamarck had said that species change over time. The key, though, is that Darwin had a mechanism, a way that happened, and he called it natural selection. He said that natural selection causes species to adapt. And so Darwin was saying these finches are related to each other on these different islands. Natural selection caused them to adapt and change. So here's a quick overview of contrast. We had Lamarck with the giraffes. Here's how Darwin would explain the giraffes. So he would say that you start with this parental group of giraffes, and they have offspring. And what happens is not all the offspring are identical. Some are a little bit taller, some are a little bit shorter. Well, these offspring compete for food and resources, and not all of them survive. So unfortunately, these short ones, they don't quite get as much food because they can't reach those high leaves, they die off, and only the tall ones manage to survive. Well, when those tall ones mate and reproduce, they're going to have offspring who are a little bit taller, and so the average height of the giraffe is now a little bit taller in this generation than it was originally. So if you repeat this process where the tallest ones have this advantage over many generations, eventually you get this population of giraffe with the really long neck. And so an abbreviation to kind of keep track of that is VEER, variation, environment, advantage, and reproduction. So in the next screencast, we're going to look at that a little more carefully and kind of tease out each of those terms and sort of clearly lay out what exactly natural selection is and how it works.